I'm Pat Berger from the Department of History of Art, and it's my great pleasure to serve as moderator for this second panel. Before we get started with our second panel, I did want to remind you of a number of things that are happening. First of all, to say that this conference today is part of a region-wide Shanghai celebration, and the centerpiece of which, of course, is the exhibition Shanghai at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. Now, Professor Ye urged everyone who hadn't seen the exhibition to this point to make sure they get over to San Francisco and see it. I believe it's open until early September. Is that right? So you have plenty of time and no excuses. More than that, I wanted to announce a couple of other things that are happening in conjunction with the overall Shanghai celebration, especially tomorrow when there are going to be 2 films on Shanghai shown at the Asian Art Museum. The first at 11 a.m. is Shanghai Triad, dating to 1995, and it's described as an epic of greed, revenge, and lust for power set in 1930s Shanghai. I'm not sure if that's a morning type of film, but it sounds like it's going to be absolutely wonderful. And at 2 p.m., 2 Stage Sisters, film dating to 1964, about the changing lives of China's women in the context of the Chinese opera world. Now, as I said, it's my pleasure to moderate the panel today, and actually this is a centerpiece panel, I think, for this conference, entitled The Arts in Shanghai. And I wanted to turn to the introduction of our first speaker. I'll be introducing the speakers one by one, just as Professor Cook did earlier this morning for our first panel. It's a very great pleasure for me, actually, to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Jay Xu, who is currently the director of the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. Jay has had a very long and distinguished career in the history of Chinese art, beginning with his graduate work at Princeton University, which culminated in a really marvelous dissertation on the bronzes from Sanxingdui, the incredible site in Sichuan province. Since then, he's had exceptional curatorial experience working at various institutions, including at the Shanghai Museum, at the Metropolitan Museum, for a considerable period of time at the Seattle Art Museum, and ultimately at the Art Institute of Chicago, where he rose to be the Pritzker Chairman of the Department of Asian and Ancient Art. And this was before coming to the Asian Art Museum to serve as director. His interests are extremely broad. Even though his graduate training was in early Chinese art, his range extends into literally the present moment. And he today is going to take on a problem that has to do, of course, with modern Shanghai. The title of his talk is, as you see, Collecting in Shanghai, Classical Connoisseurs Meet Modernity, the Case of Wu Dachang. Let's welcome Director Xu.
Hello, Professor Berger. Thank you very much for introduction. And I just took a look at my time. I understand only 20 minutes. And so let's get started. Today's symposium focuses on the early 20th centuries, but my topic actually is somewhat outside this time frame as I explore the phenomenon of art collecting in the last decades of the 19th centuries. Perhaps I can justify this choice by saying that my research deals with the first generation of a series of art collectors in the greater Shanghai region after Shanghai was opened up as a trading port following the First Opium War. And in doing so, I hope to help pave way for further research on art collecting in the interwar Shanghai. My choice of the topic was prompted by the scroll in the Shanghai exhibition currently on view in our museum, showing Qing scholar official Wu Dacheng, 1835 to 1902, portrayed in a traditional interior setting surrounded by ancient bronzes and a number of other objects, as you see here. I'm a student of ancient Chinese bronzes, and Wu Dacheng was a noted collector in that field. So I was immediately attracted to the scroll and wanted to do something about it. It is a simple motivation that led me on a journey, of which the first stop is UC Berkeley here. But I'm not sure that where I will end the journey with, and I think I'm going outside of my boundary really into modern Shanghai. I was simply attracted by bronzes, and I want to see what I can come up with. And modern Shanghai turned out to be extremely fascinating town, naturally, for me, because I was born and raised in Shanghai, and but I realized there's so much to learn about Shanghai that I don't know. And also, I would like to clarify the geographical scope of my study. Earlier, I mentioned art collecting in the greater Shanghai region. What I meant by greater Shanghai region includes cities and towns in places nearby Shanghai, such as Suzhou. Wu Daceng was a Suzhou native, and throughout his official career, he often returned to Suzhou for various family occasions, and Suzhou was where many of the artworks in his collection were first gathered. Wu typically transited through Shanghai en route to or from Suzhou, and he took refuge in Shanghai during 1960 to 1962 because of the Taiping Rebellion. Towards the end of his life, after he was permanently barred from government service in 1898, he became the head of a school in Shanghai, where many works from his collection were sold or otherwise dispersed. And today, I will focus on this particular scroll and another related one in the Shanghai Museum's collection and see what we can say about classical connoisseurs meet modernity. Let us take one step back and see what Shanghai looked like in the second half of the 19th centuries. The first image that people nowadays can draw up about Shanghai at that time is probably something like this. An image of the famous Bund, lined with trading houses and merchant ships carrying an endless array of merchandise, including the infamous opium. As a matter of fact, this is one of the first paintings that you encounter in the Shanghai exhibition. Such an image potently characterizes the nature of Shanghai as a trading port, with a large infusion of foreign traders and settlers, and along with it, the growth of a city and the foreign influence, particularly Western influences. This image of traditional attired Chinese women with bound feet trying out Western-style cuisine in a Western restaurant setting is a lively example of the mixing of the East and the West at a burgeoning city. On the other hand, however, as Professor Wen Xingye points out in her essay in the Shanghai Exhibition Catalog, Shanghai, quote, a tale of three cities, end quote, one of which was the old town with its own city walls. As we see here, the old town was where Chinese scholars officials, artists, and collective traditional art typically lived and gathered. For example, the Duckweed Society for Painting and Calligraphy, which Wu Daceng joined during his refuge in Shanghai, was located in the western part of the old town. And our next speaker, Professor Shen Kuiyi's subject, Wang Yiting, and he lived in the old town as well, and his artistic circle there, certainly. First established in 1851 as a society for poetry, the Duckweed Society was an important literary club of the time. Antique dealers and the markets also concentrated in the old town as well. In the area of two north gates where the old town bordered the foreign settlements, as they catered to both domestic Chinese customers as well as the new rivals from the West. This pair of images can perhaps visually summarize the cultural contrast in the city of Shanghai. In cultural geography, I must point out, the old town of Shanghai was surely much closer to Suzhou than to the foreign settlements that it neighbored. It is in this cultural setting that art collections were typically developed among Chinese collectors in the late 19th centuries. By the age of 21, while living in Suzhou, Wu Daceng had developed an interest in ancient inscriptions on bronzes and stone steles, apparently under the influence of his maternal grandfather, Han Luqing, who was a noted collector of ancient inscriptions. His first known epigraphical work, which was a copy of an annotated transcription of the inscription on the famous Guoji Zibaipan, was done in Shanghai in 1861. When in his 30s, Wu Daceng had firmly established his lifelong pursuit of epigraphic study. Starting in 1872, he began to produce drawings and transcriptions for the bronzes in the collections of Pan Zuying, 1830 to 1890, his native Suzhou friend and teacher, who had already established a reputation as a foremost collector. At the same time, Wu Daceng himself began to collect intensively. 20 years later, in 1892, When this scroll was painted, Wu Dazheng had become the most respected scholar of ancient epigraphy and collector and connoisseur of bronzes and jades and other antiques. 1892 was the year when Wu Dazheng became the governor of Hunan province in central southern China. Before that, he had served in various government posts in the capital and in the northwest, the northeast, deep in the south, and in central China. He collected antiques wherever he served. Although he never served in his native land, the greater Shanghai region was nevertheless an important source of his collection. That was largely because of one particular hometown friend of his by the name of Xu Xi, who acted as an agent in pursuing antiques. For example, this is a letter that from Wu Dazheng to Xu Xi, and I can translate a little bit to you, and if I can see well. It says here that in my letter, I request you to purchase on my behalf paintings and calligraphies, bronzes, jades, masterpieces, and you have acquired so much, and all the prices are very reasonable, cheap, and for me, therefore, I have ascended a mountain of treasures and come back with a full load. So he was ecstatic, and this seemed repeated several times in his other letters. You know, the antiques were abundant and prices were very reasonable. And Xu Xi, whose informal first name is Han Qing, which is at the beginning of the letter, you know, was his ardent agent in pursuit of antiquities. And however, Xu Xi's biography and his detail about life was rather obscure. I think, so any of you, if you know anything about Xu Hanqing or Xu Xi, I'd love to hear it. Of course, my research is still very early in its beginning. So, for example, I have not checked Suzhou's Fangzi and so on and so forth, other material yet. I'm sure there's somewhere more information about him can be found. So at this point, at least to me, not much is known about him except that he was a connoisseur of antiques and an expert in carving seals. She was obviously among the circle of literary friends associated with Wu Dazheng, as he was known to be present at a friend's party held in Shanghai in 1892 to bid farewell to Wu Dazheng when Wu embarked on his journey back to Beijing after mourning for his mother's death in Suzhou. Today, we can still see at least 26 letters from Wu Dazheng to Xu Xi, written between 1884 to 1894. That was the 10 years when Wu Dazheng was really at the peak of his official career. One of them is shown here. Almost all of the letters discuss antiques and many about art purchases that Xu did for Wu or Wu asked Xu to do, such as in this letter. Based in Suzhou and Shanghai, the source of those art purchases were obviously in the greater Shanghai region. And by 1892, when this scroll was painted, Wu Dazheng obviously had assembled a very remarkable collection of ancient bronzes among many other objects of other media. And in this particular scroll, 27 ancient bronzes were depicted in the painting. Those clearly belong to Wu's collection, undoubtedly. And following the painting, this is a hand scroll, so it goes very long, and in the exhibition you only see part of it. Following the painting were full figure rubbing of 45 vessels, 8 of which appeared in both painting and rubbings. In other words, a total of 64 vessels were depicted in the scroll. In addition, there is another scroll of the same subject matter, painted in the same year as seen here, in which a similar number of vessels were depicted in painting and or rubbings, and the two scrolls share many objects in common. Allegedly, there was even a third scroll of the same subject, whose whereabouts is not known. One perhaps cannot help wondering why Wu Dazheng would commission more than one scroll of the same subject. 1892 was surely an important year for Wu Dazheng. In the period of 10 years before that, Wu Dazheng had attained remarkable achievements in his career. including successful border negotiation with Russia and the monumental flood control project in the Middle Yellow River region. In the spring of that year, his friends gave him a farewell party in Shanghai for his return to Beijing, as mentioned before. Perhaps the scrolls were painted around that time. It is clear that Wu at least brought one of the two scrolls with him to Beijing, and he asked his colleagues in Beijing to write colophons on it after he was appointed governor of Hunan, a powerful region in late Qing. And also, they did the colophon before he left Beijing for Hunan. Undoubtedly, his new position was the result of his extraordinary success in flood control, which his predecessor failed miserably. Wu Dazheng was known to carry on his collecting and study wherever he was, even during the demanding flood control project, as made clear by this letter to Xu Xi, dated in 1888. And he was talking about the laborers would probably accomplish the project on time, and the dam will eventually close on the 17th day or the 18th day. But once he mentions this, he go right away saying, I want to go back to my painting and calligraphy study and the pursuit of bronzes and jades. So he leads this two-parallel life very, very nicely. So in some way, I try to emulate him as well. Pushing papers sometimes and come to do a little study here and there. So 1888, of course, was the high time of the flood control project. And studying antiques was obviously Wu Dazheng's true passion. Now, the Shanghai exhibition includes quite a few portraits, as I can recall, altogether 5 in addition to the scroll, in which all these portraits, as 2 of which are shown here, are typically set in a garden setting, as seen in these 2 examples, as well in the other 3 that I cannot show you, but you can see in the exhibition. By contrast, Wu Dazheng's portraits stand out for its domestic setting and its unmistakable environment of a collector and a scholar of antiquities. Interestingly, the particular domestic setting, the furniture that he is surrounded and he uses, with Wu sitting on a low dais, seem to be rather removed from his own time and hark back to remote antiquity. The source of inspiration for such a setting is evidently paintings such as this one, a portrait of famous Yuan painter and recluse Nizan, painted in the 14th centuries. What did Wu Dazheng try to express by having his portrait painted in a close stylistic and iconographical bond with ancient times, and by focusing on studying and collecting antiquities? We know that Wu Dazheng was part of the reform movement to modernize China. Namely, in order to strengthen China against the West, China needed to learn from the West its technologies of manufacturing ships and guns, and scientific knowledge behind the military technology. Wu Dazheng was also surely familiar with the Western environment in Shanghai, a city that he frequently passed by and also sojourned. In this context, the portrait of Wu Dazheng in a traditional setting, surrounded by tangible manifestations of an ancient civilization, may be viewed as a powerful visual statement of the core value of the ruling elite at the time, that is, the classical tradition of ancient China, despite the need to learn from Western technology. And this thesis, of course, is not new. It's very familiar to the scholars of modern China. When classical connoisseurs meet modernity, in this case, it was antiquity that prevailed. While Shanghai was being rapidly developed into an international trading port, it also became a stronghold of Chinese traditions. Wu Dazheng returned to Shanghai for the last time in 1896, after he was relieved of his official duty as a result of his disastrous defeat at the army under his command suffered at the hands of the invading Japanese troops in Liaoning in northeastern China. There in Shanghai, he took up a private job as the headmaster of a private college. But his fortune started to fall, and he had to rely on the sale of part of his collection for income. For this and other reasons, his collection started to disperse. Today, the bronzes depicting those 2 scrolls are found mostly in the collections of the Shanghai Museum, which luckily is also where my career started. But some are in the collection of the Nanjing Museum, Harvard University Museum, and the British Museum. And also in our very own Asian Art Museum. And that is this vessel. It's even on view that Michael Knight put it on view quite next to the scroll depicting Wu Daceng, so make sure you don't miss it. The story of disbursement of Wu's collection and his epigraphic study will hopefully be the future stops of my journey from Wu Daceng, and also the interesting contrast and similarity between these two scrolls themselves is itself a wonderful story to tell, but that somewhat lies outside scope of today's symposium. Thank you very much.